Occupying Till He Comes at Southwest Prophecy Ministries.
Welcome, friends. This is Dane Rome, your announcer for today's Last Days Beacon program. Thanks for joining us. Just a reminder that these programs are supported by your gifts to this ministry. If you would like to contribute to our ongoing ministry that deals with Bible prophecy and current events, simply go to our website to contribute. Our website address is www.swpm.us. You'll find a donate link on the homepage. The website address again is www.swpm.us. Thank you for your prayers and support for this faith ministry. And now, let's join Dr. Dave Schnichter for another Last Days Beacon program.
Thank you, Dane. It is a real privilege today to continue our interview with Chris Pinto with Adullam Films. Chris is the writer, director, and producer of this month's featured film entitled Dark Clouds Over Elberton. We're going to continue speaking with Chris about this intriguing film today. For those who were with us last time, we learned about Chris's conversion to Jesus Christ, his call to a film ministry, Christian film ministry, that produces really some cutting-edge films, some of which we talked about last week, the esoteric history of America, and the covert nature of some of the things that were being espoused by folks with alternative views regarding the founding of America. Well, today we're going to transition and focus in on the film itself. And I'm going to ask Chris if you would share with our listeners, probably most of which have never even heard of Elberton, Georgia, something about the Georgia Guidestones, what they are, and the message that they convey.
Well, my first encounter with the Georgia Guidestones was when I was working on my film Megiddo II, The New Age, just to give you a little background on it. And I had heard about them initially from Dr. Stan Monteith, the late Dr. Stan Monteith, who was radio host for many years, was considered a pioneer in a lot of this information. And Dr. Stan was a friend of mine for years. I've been to his house several times, interviewed him for several films, but I interviewed him for Megiddo II, The New Age, and he talked about the Georgia Guidestones. And so I remember learning about it from him, and we had about a 10-minute section in Megiddo II on it. But basically what happened was about 1980, this monument was erected in the small town of Elberton, Georgia, which is known as the granite capital of the world. And they're known for making all these granite monuments. They make many tombstones and so on out of granite, but they also make other monuments as well. And they have these granite quarries there. And this stranger had come into town sometime earlier, and he was this well-dressed man, a professional, and he went to a local granite business and said he wanted a monument. He wanted to pay for having a monument erected, and he met with a guy named Joe Fendley there, who was the owner of this granite business, and he sat down with him, but he wouldn't give his real name. He said his name was R.C. Christian, and that this was a pseudonym, that he admitted it was not his real name. And so the owner, Joe Fendley, thought, he didn't know what to think. He thought maybe this guy was crazy. He wasn't sure. And then he asked him how big he wanted this monument to be. And then, of course, once he explained that it was going to be, 15 to 18 feet in height and so on, he realized it was going to be a massive monument and would be an expensive project. So he ends up sending him over to another man named Wyatt Martin, who was the banker there in the town of Elberton, because he needed to be able to set things up financially to give reassurance he was going to be able to pay for this project. And so the man goes and he meets with Wyatt Martin, and Mr. Martin talks to him, gets the idea for this thing, and finally he says, R.C. Christian says to Wyatt Martin that he wants him to be the facilitator, the person who handles all the financing for this. He wants him to open an account for him. And he says, well, I can do that, but I can only open an account if you tell me your real name. And so R.C. Christian said, okay, I'll give you my real name, provided you don't reveal it to anyone. And he said, okay. And so that's kind of where the mystery of, really the great mystery of the Guidestones begins. Then what happens is this monument is built, and in 1980 it's unveiled to the world, and they have all this press there and all these people watching the unveiling of it. And then there are these 10 commands, or what looks like a 10 commandments type monument, because there's 10 guides, they're actually called. They're not really commands, they're guides. But the first one says to maintain humanity under 500 million people in perpetual balance with nature. And so when everybody saw that first guide to maintain humanity under 500 million people, they began to think, well, wait a minute, there's about 6 billion people in the world. How could anybody maintain 500 million people? You'd have to get rid of a lot of people. And then the other guides that are listed there all have a kind of New Age environmentalist type worldview, where, you know, the last one says, be not a cancer on the earth, leave room for nature, leave room for nature, which seems to favor the environmentalist view that mankind is really a cancer on the earth, and we need to get rid of people, supposedly, and make more room for trees and animals and this kind of thing to run around. That's kind of the environmentalist worldview.
Right.
And so the monument, once it was unveiled, I mean, this is a town where, you know, it's Georgia, it's in the South, the Deep South, and a lot of the people are church-going, professing, cultural Christians and this kind of thing. So it caused a bit of a stir, a bit of an uproar when it was first revealed. And the main thing was the secrecy of the identity of R.C. Christian. Who was R.C. Christian? So you had all these newspaper articles written about it, and who could this be? And people were speculating, is he some famous businessman? Is he, some people thought he was Ted Turner, and all these other theories about his identity. But that's the mystery of the Guidestones in a nutshell.
Well, I know that the monument has stirred up a great deal of controversy over the last 37 years, and some people will make a pilgrimage to the Guidestones and throw paint on it or sandblast it and cause other kinds of damage, and as their way of protesting this admittedly controversial granite monument that is in 8 major languages. So that regardless of whether you are American and can read good old English, or whether you're Israeli and understand Hebrew, and the others, this is certainly meant to be a message that would be understood universally by those who are, comprise the 8 major language groups. And obviously, it would stand out in in the buckle of the Bible Belt. In terms of where this would be located, it might have a bit more congruence if it was, erected in downtown Manhattan or Paris, France. Well, obviously, we don't want to spoil the film by telling the name of this individual, but by the end of the film, there's, I think, a very convincing evidence as to who this gentleman was. But as you undertook
now something interesting I wanted to point out here, his name, R.C. Christian, people have speculated for years about why he chose that name, which he openly admitted was a pseudonym, and it is generally thought that he took the name because of Christian Rosenkreutz, who is said to be the mythical founder of Rosicrucianism from the Middle Ages. And that's a whole nother dimension of this. And we found when we were investigating at Coggins Industries, because a guy named Coggins was one of the very prominent businessmen there in Elberton who was affiliated with the whole project. And they were very nice to us, and they gave us some paperwork on the guide stones that they had in their files, and in it was a letter that stated that whoever finds this writing was to hand it over to the Rosicrucian Society there in Georgia, in Atlanta. Okay? We talked with the Atlanta Rosicrucians. They did not want to appear on camera, but they themselves were not willing to share any information with us about it. It seems like the letter that specifically mentioned Rosicrucianism was something that had been written to be placed inside the time capsule. But then, of course, there's all this mystery and debate about whether or not there really is a time capsule beneath the concrete slab or the granite slab that's next to the monument that gives descriptions of everything that's there. But another interesting detail, Wyatt Martin said when he met with the man, he asked him why he had chosen the name R.C. Christian, and his response was, he said, because I am a Christian. That's what he said. And so Wyatt Martin, who's a very nice man, we interviewed him, he appears in the film, just proceeded, he just accepted that testimony. Now, what's troubling, however, is that on the granite slab, it says specifically, let these be guide stones to an age of reason. Let these be guide stones to an age of reason. And the phrase, the age of reason, is specifically the title of the book that was published by Thomas Paine after the American Revolution and about, well, just after the time of the French Revolution, if I remember correctly. But Thomas Paine, who wrote the pamphlet, the famous pamphlet Common Sense, in which he's making very Bible-based Puritan, Protestant, Christian arguments in favor of resisting King George III, and basically making an argument that says we ought to obey God rather than men, if you know the pamphlet Common Sense.
Oh, it was
Paine wrote that
very
initially.
influential.
Very influential.
Yes.
People, in fact, that was largely credited with the War for Independence. But then 20 years later, Paine writes The Age of Reason, in which he completely denounces the Bible and Christianity, and calls Christianity a fraud, and says he thinks it should be abolished and all this other kind of stuff. Just very irreverent, hostile approach to Christianity. And so that's the part of this, David, that becomes very mysterious and disturbing. When you take the depopulation element, maintain a population at below 500 million, and then the Age of Reason, talking about the abolishment of Christianity, and then you think about the very New Age, pagan, occultic overtones of the monument in general, and I even take it a step further. Look at the persecution against Christians that's going on throughout the world right now, and how the governments of the West, the Western world that in general had always professed Christianity for centuries and centuries, now, as it's become more secularist, secular humanist, militant atheist, and now giving itself over to ecumenism and Islam, inviting Islam into all of these countries, that is notoriously anti-Christian, it gives you pause. You have to sit back and wonder if this whole thing is part of a greater agenda, a globalist agenda, because there's no question that the globalists are exceedingly hostile to Christianity and the Bible. There's just no question about that.
And I think you're right in saying that the West is strangely silent and passive in light of the genocide that's being carried out with Christians, particularly in the Middle East.
Oh, yeah, this whole situation in Iraq and Syria. I mean, I've got a podcast myself called Noise of Thunder Radio, and I've talked about for months and probably more than a year now, just how it's disgraceful that our country, that really was founded easily for the first 150 years as an openly Christian country, where the cause of Christ and the Bible and the gospel was the cause of the American colonies. And it was very Bible-based Christian arguments that were employed at the time of the Revolution and to encourage the Revolution. And so now, more than 200 years later, to see our country stand by and watch Christians being slaughtered and raped and enslaved and murdered and crucified and so on in other parts of the world, when we have the ability to do something about it, to see our government stand by, or so it appears, and do nothing, it's very disturbing. Very, very disturbing to me, and I think to many others as well.
Oh, absolutely. Now, as you carried out this investigation, which was a 5-year process and very, how should we say, thorough, and great to watch as the investigation moved forward, and you were able to identify this individual who was the primary financier of the Georgia Guidestones. Did you find a connection between this individual, perhaps their writings or associations, that tended to support the idea that this individual had a, what we might say, a radical environmental philosophy and depopulation agenda?
Well, there is the book that he published 5 years after the Guidestones were erected. The Guidestones were set up in 1980. Everybody had all of these speculations about them and so on, but then 5 years later, R.C. Christian, using the name Robert Christian, published a book on the Guidestones. And that book makes it very, very clear. You know, they still offer the book there at the Granite Museum in Elberton, Georgia, which is probably 15 or 20 minutes from where the Guidestones are. But anyway, the book itself, he explains in great detail why the Guidestones were erected, why they were built, and there's no question that over and over and over again, he says he believes the number one problem facing mankind is overpopulation. That he'd been to many different countries in the world, and he'd seen what happens when you have too many people in towns and cities and in countries and so on. And he believed that it was an evil thing to allow a population to get that big, and that governments needed to get involved with doing something to reduce the general population. And he says this over and over again. He even makes reference to China and the fact that China for many years had their one-child policy, so that if parents were pregnant with a second child, they were forced to abort the second child. So he's calling on somewhat draconian methods to be employed to keep the population down. And he says this over and over again in a variety of ways throughout the book. So he leaves virtually no room for doubt about his views. Then, and I'm not going to reveal too much about this because I think people need to see the film, we actually went to the town, we followed a trail of evidence, went to the town where we found more information on the individual that we believe was R.C. Christian. And there in his local town, he was somewhat known for having these views.
So this wasn't something he kept to himself. He had associates or friends that were aware of.
Exactly, and we actually interviewed some of them on camera. And, of course, they were very surprised at the connection with the monument. However, the philosophy that's being communicated was very much in keeping with his own philosophy, his own worldview. And so that was part of what we felt put the pieces of the puzzle together.
In other words, this individual fit the profile of one who would invest a massive amount of money and time in erecting this monument, which I'm sure he intended to communicate to mankind long after his death, that he was certainly a devotee of everything that was inscribed in this monument.
Oh, exactly. Exactly. all of the evidence points in that direction. But of course, we lay it out, and then it's for an audience to decide. They have to come to their own conclusion. But the philosophy is very, very clear, and it's somewhat disturbing when you look at what groups have done over the last 100 years. You look at the different genocides, like the Armenian genocide, which influenced what went on with Hitler and the Holocaust, where Hitler killed 6 million Jews, and then he killed another 5 million non-Jews that many people are not aware of. They don't realize about 11 million were killed in Hitler's death camps. Then you get to Stalin, and I've seen numbers anywhere from 40 to 60 million on Joseph Stalin during his whole time in power in the Soviet Union. Then the numbers in China, the killing fields of Cambodia, and many other parts of the world, not to mention Islam. How many have been killed by Islam just in the past 100 years? There seems to be an agenda and then there's the Rwanda genocide, which you go study that with the United Nations and so on. The information gets very, very disturbing. You have all of these genocidal programs that have been carried out in one way or another for the past 100 years. And so this is not just a conspiracy theory about something that the globalists or people in power might seek to do at some point. It's something that they've been doing over and over and over again. And when you look at, in fact, I've got friends who are looking at this situation where they're bringing all of these Muslims into the Western world by the millions now. It's estimated they've got 50 million Muslims throughout Western Europe. In 1968, when this was first beginning, there was a well-known UK politician named Enoch Powell. And Powell had given a famous speech back then called his Rivers of Blood speech, and this Rivers of Blood speech was often referenced during the Brexit vote.
Oh, interesting.
By people like Nigel Farage and many others over in the UK. They were continually talking about Powell's Rivers of Blood speech, but in it, he said he was watching this massive number of immigrants that were coming into Western Europe. And these are Muslims here, many of them. These are the historic enemies of Christianity and the West. And he said if this continues, he said he could envision rivers of blood flowing in Europe.
Well, he was definitely a prophet.
All of these different warning signs.
Yes. So really, the Georgia Guidestones for Christians and people who are alert to this depopulation agenda will look at these Guidestones really as a warning to humanity, people who, love life, who love God, and who value human life. They will see this really as a very physical expression of the ongoing threat of the globalist depopulation agenda, wouldn't they?
Oh, I think so. Definitely. It's definitely there, and it affects, I think, many different areas of society. It especially affects the left, the left wing. There are many people, of course, who believe that this is what's really behind the abortion movement.
Oh, absolutely.
The abortion movement is really about regulating population. It's not so much about a woman's right to choose.
No,
it's about keeping the population numbers down.
Oh, absolutely. And when you think about the countries that abort massively, though our record is not a good one, but I've heard that in China they abort something on the order of 40 million babies per year, which makes the Holocaust pale in comparison. So the Holocaust did not end with the Cultural Revolution in China. It has continued today. And because it takes place in the, antiseptic halls of, abortion clinics where we don't see them, somehow we're not as aware or alarmed by the massive destruction of human life. And of course, Planned Parenthood has been aborting something on the order of 1/3 babies per year. Sadly, in the last 8 years, partially funded by American taxpayers, which is a subject for another discussion. But certainly the Georgia Guidestones really, I think, in an overt way, tell us what the agenda of the globalists really is. And it's a very disturbing agenda. Well, we're out of time for today, Chris. This has been a fascinating discussion. My hope is that our listeners will have their appetites whetted to indulge in this whodunit mystery, which is very, in my view, wonderfully and masterfully laid out as you follow the investigators step by step to uncover the identity of this mysterious R.C. Christian and really what his agenda is in putting this, what some call America's Stonehenge, outside the little town of Elberton, Georgia. And people come from all over, pilgrimages either to support or oppose this agenda, but it is there for all to see. And so I want to encourage our listeners to take advantage of this opportunity. And so I'll turn it over to Dane Rome, our announcer, who will share with you how you can obtain a copy of this fascinating 2-hour DVD entitled Dark Clouds Over Elberton.
Thank you, Dr. Schnitzer. My friends, this month we're featuring an excellent DVD entitled Dark Clouds Over Elberton. This 2-hour film is a fascinating and true whodunit mystery told masterfully by award-winning producer Chris Pinto. Many are aware of the mysterious guide stones constructed outside Elberton, Georgia back in 1979. Known as America's Stonehenge, these granite pillars contain the 10 Commandments of the New World Order. Who was this mysterious benefactor known as R.C. Christian who financed this project? After a 5-year investigation, this powerful documentary presents groundbreaking information and dares to solve the mystery of who R.C. Christian really was. This film's a must-see for those who wish to learn more about the globalist use of environmentalism toward the cause of population control. You may obtain a copy of this film for a gift of $24.95 plus shipping. Simply go to the homepage of our website, www.swpm.us, to find the film. The website again is www.swpm.us. And please join us next week for another Last Days Beacon program brought to you by Southwest Prophecy Ministries. Until then, this is Dane Rome. Thanks for listening.